What up, boys and girls, ladies and gentlemen? It is Jesse Warden. Today is Sunday, June 11th, 2023. And today we were supposed to cover a lot of React and Redux and testing, but I realized a lot of the slides that I did for my work require a ton of editing to not show private data, so it's going to take a while to edit those slides. The presentation is about an hour. It covers a lot of ground of testing and stuff and why we do things. And with some of the whys, it actually can border an hour and 15 minutes. So I want to make sure it's right, has enough information. So this week, we're going to focus on how not to overwhelm your development team and disappoint the business. It's a white paper. It's only about 7 pages, so it's a pretty quick read. PayFit is a company who's over in Europe practicing domain-driven design. They have a very familiar approach from just a lot of different terms from financing, so I found it kind of interesting. And overdebugging, very interesting thing around dealing with breakpoints and console logs. And Dave Thomas, one of the authors of The Pragmatic Programmer, recently was interviewed by Dave Farley and talked about how he stopped debugging for 6 months. And some of his comments on the interview, if you take them in context, are interesting. But if you just listen to those comments normally of what he says in those, I think it's like 10 or 11 minutes with Dave Farley, I was just like, what? I mean, you have these two brilliant individuals, and some of them are just saying complete opposite things. And I'm just like, why do I even try? And the last thing is actually covering Dave's video, further video after the interview about unit testing is not enough. So that's what we're going to cover today, pretty quick, since I'm not doing a Prezo. So let's talk about this white paper. This white paper is called How Not to Overwhelm Your Development Team and Disappoint the Business. And what it really is about is specifically around this gentleman went through and talked to, I think it's a PMO of just a really big organization that organizes a lot of work. And if you look at what a lot of the problems that often happen is that all of us, product, engineering, design, we're all trying to make the business happy because they're the ones who make the money. They're the ones who recognize and represent our customers. And so a lot of times we'll overpromise and underdeliver. And a lot of the processes are set up around that to even further cause that problem. So there's this constant perception of we're not delivering on time, we're not delivering enough, and it's constantly slow, and there's no easy way to predict it. And so I liked this PMO's approach. I didn't like the concept of story points and Scrum and things like that, but I did like the concept of looking at all those problems, recognizing that they are problems, and then working through. So if you go here where he says imagine, I'll put this link in the description of the video, but he says, now imagine an organization where nobody is playing this particular role, or even an organization where the PMO sees their role as pushing the development teams to commit to as many business requests as possible. This whole paper talks about doing the opposite, looking at what development teams do from their velocity, and he actually measures it in a street. So this isn't like what I talked about a couple weeks ago where he's using Monte Carlo simulations. He's literally working specifically with teams who have problems with estimation, which I would be one of those teams because I'm just like, how many points can you deliver in a sprint? 1. You sure you can do 5? 1. Right? I'm not trying to be difficult. I just think estimation is ridiculous. But we can reasonably estimate on small stories, and I'm a big fan of focusing on the most important thing and get it done. I have those cards, which are actually downstairs, that all story points should be 1. But whatever. So takes these numbers, recognize that particular team's velocity and the actual velocity, not what they promise they can do the sprint. For example, they'll say 8, but they constantly do 4. 2 to 4, that's just like their average. So he works with them to identify that. Once he has the low level of working with these teams, making sure they are capable of doing reasonable estimates, he then does the zoom out, looks at all their estimates, and recognizes, okay, this is what we can do. This is historic. Perhaps he is running Monte Carlo simulations. He didn't mention it in his white paper, but bottom line is he feels those estimates are accurate, and he works with the business to find what is the priority now and what can we do, and then he builds in buffer. And a lot of that's either teams that need what I hate, which are sprints that are called like, I forget the word for them, but it's where they focus on technical debt, like cleanup sprints or something like that. Just awful. But some teams need that. They need to like take a breath and like, focus and emotionally say, we need to work on technical debt. And some of them could be a DevOps thing that is larger than they thought. They might need other teams' help, for example. But the rest of them are calculating, I'm just going to make up a number because he doesn't really cite it, but around 80% of their capacity is total work. The other 20% is if things change, they need to work with other teams. They need to either they learn something and they have to compensate and reprioritize. So all of that's taken into an account, and he works his way with the business. So I found it really interesting because if you go through every single one of those, this person's sole job is to reprioritize with the business instead of pushing people to their limit where they just don't produce good work and they don't ever hit any type of understanding of what can we plan for? Can we have any type of like reasonable projections here? So it's pretty interesting from that perspective on looking on planning. So I'll put the link to this in the video description. So the second one was from Valentina, and she is just consistently writing some pretty interesting consulting style articles where she'll interface with teams and they'll have problems. This particular one is where they've tried either testing or TDD and it just doesn't work because they have really bad experiences. And I've experienced this umpteen times over years, but because I'm just not willing to give up, I'm stubborn. I just kept trying. And so I like this attitude of acknowledging where they went, acknowledging that was valid, that was frustrating, and recognizing that what they were doing just caused problems and how they can fix it doing TDD. So if you look at it, I agree with 99% of what she says. I think the problem I have with these kind of posts is they'll recognize the practices the teams do, not writing tests first or how they write tests first, or recognizing they got all that, but they don't know how to mock well, or whatever those little tactical things are. The strategy's right, but the actual implementation details, she's a consultant. She's there to help with. I think that's great. Where I have a problem is when they start saying things like, let me see if I can find it. It's at the bottom. It's hexagon. Yeah, there it is. Hexagonal. It's when they recommend hexagonal. Like, I don't know if you've ever seen hexagonal, but like if you're an OOP developer, you're like, all right, fine. I'm already in a morass of design patterns. But when you're like, imperative programmer or a functional programmer, you just like, I never understood this at all. Like it's coupling and cohesion taken to the nth degree, and you got to memorize all these patterns, and it takes like a book to understand. And I'm like, dude, if you read Redux by someone who's not like Redux or Redux Toolkit, like I can explain the 4 concepts and you'll be fine, right? Or even Elm. It doesn't require a book, but if you read the hexagonal architectures, it requires a bloody book. It's so ridiculous. But if you ignore that and focus on everything else in her article, it's fantastic. I love how where the team went and how to guide them on the right path. So I like these kind of articles because I just I have constant problems where, from a consulting perspective, let me jump ahead real quick. I'll show you an example of where I struggle. So I was talking about Dave Farley's recent video and talking to all the my heroes that I see on LinkedIn and Twitter, and I was like, you got to follow these people. So Bryant Finster, one of my heroes, actually responded, and the thing that I stuck with me said, newsflash, you cannot be an effective technical leader at any level without these skills. Technical skills is insufficient. He's talking specifically around soft skills, like teamwork, working with your teams, not being a jerk, like wanting to be a good sport, right? Like it's nice to win, but it's also nice that the weakest link, right, matters. So you help your team. Like team cohesion is important. Building relationships, not just with product and design, but those kind of things as well. Of recognizing that, like, if I have a good relationship with my BA and my designer, then when I have concerns or questions, they know it comes from a good place. I'm not being a jerk. Like, I really want to learn. They know that my agenda is to build a good product. So that's formed over like just professional things, like how can I help, to personal things like how was your weekend, small talk, things like that. I suck at that stuff, but they know I'm genuine, right? Building trust. They know through my consistent work and what I actually deliver that all I care about is like the user, right? I want to do a good job. So that takes time. This is where I get frustrated. So see how this is building trust? That takes time. And so when you look at the TDD stuff, a lot of this stuff is great. I've done it for years, but teams that haven't, it takes a lot to unlearn 5 years of work. If you're a junior, it takes a lot to unlearn 2 months, right? You can't do that unless you have trust. Building trust takes time. So by the time I get the trust, especially at Accenture and other clients, I would leave. It wasn't my fault. It's just how taxes work. After a year, you can't work for them. So by the time you get the trust, you can't bloody use it. But you never know. Sometimes there's people who want to learn. So I love these kind of articles. I highly recommend Valentina. She's constantly on Twitter and LinkedIn, posts a lot of good stuff. All right, so the PayFit, this one was kind of boring because I don't do this large style nomenclature anymore. A lot of times, especially Capital One, we had very different teams in different verticals and horizontals that all said the same word, but it meant 50 different things in 50 different contexts. And so that's where domain-driven design really helps, because you all agree on a language. It's very similar to what Her Majesty, the wife, used to do for information architecture, where we all identify what those words are, what they mean to the user versus what they mean to the backend, because both are important. And it's okay to use that language, but we've got to define what is the bounded context, so the area in which we can lay code and those boundaries where we can communicate something out, right? So an example would be like very similar to what we're dealing with at work, where we have Cognito, and the groups that you assign people Cognito means something very important in the application. And so that language is a constant source of struggle because the bounded context leaks a little bit, right? So she talks about, or this team really talks about, how they went through from a finance perspective. And this diagram, which is down, let's see, not there. I think it's in the middle. Yeah, this one right here, where the words on the left and right mean very, very different things, and like payroll period versus pay period. And I've seen that all the time too, where they have the same nouns, but they mean something completely different. And when you look in the code base, you get confused because you're like, am I talking to the design team or the other team? And so these kind of exercises, I love to see people actually attempting to do it, what their learnings are and what their struggles were, because a lot of times this has nothing to do with code or architecture. We're literally just trying to define, are we speaking about the same thing? So really, really just good to see these kind of articles. Again, it's quick read. All right, so this one, I found it through a Twitter argument. So Damian Plaza, I think he's from Poland. He's smart. Like, I've seen some of his tweets, because I don't like, the Twitter algorithm now allows me to see people that I talk to. So even though I don't follow them, I see them in discussions and I see their tweets. And if I interact, like, it thinks I want to, interact with their tweets more, even if I don't follow them, which is kind of a nice feature. So he posted an article about overdebugging. It was specifically around weaning yourself off of breakpoints and console logs. And quick story. So I was at a startup last fall, winter, whatever, and I was just struggling. I couldn't figure out this code base. We had types, but I just could not figure out why it was coming back in some certain way. And so my boss is like, use a breakpoint. And it didn't register like what he said. I'm like, use a what? Like, I hadn't used breakpoints in like, I don't know, 3 years, right? Like, unless, like, usually when you broke out the breakpoints, right, or like massive amounts of console logs, is either in JavaScript when you don't have a clear contract to the back end. Same thing with Python, where you're just getting these dictionaries and JSON, you don't know what they are. There's no contract, there's no enforcement, there's no schema, there's no protobuf, there's nothing. It's just random data, and there's no version API, so it can constantly change, so you don't know, right? Or you're like in a really bad spot. You're like, dude, this is third-party code or my code. The code's messed up. I don't know what's going on. Like, there's no way to, test it. And so that's where I come from, is I constantly test it and I write assertions. And so somebody said, what do you mean you don't use breakpoints or logs? I'm like, well, I do logs for monitoring, but I don't use them in like debugging unless like I'm trying to figure out what the JSON is. Beyond that, like, the only time I put console logs is in other people's code because their code isn't testable. And so this article really captured my challenge. And that is, you're in the code, you're writing logs, you're using a debugger, you're trying to figure out what the state of it is. And like, how did I get here? Like, well, I got here because this code isn't tested. Like, I don't understand what it's doing. There's no way to like say, I expect this, or I'm unhappy about that, I expect this. Like, that doesn't exist. So I have to go in and add breakpoints and whatever. And so he talks about almost like you have an addiction, right? And goes through and explains how we got here. And then he explains, all right, so now let's try this. And it's going to hurt. And let's try to go out of it. So it's almost like you acknowledge your addiction, right? From an alcoholic anonymous perspective, which is so horrible. But it felt like that, because I would see these people using console logs and breakpoints. I'm like, dude, what are you doing? And they would look at me like, dude, what are you doing? Like, what do you mean you don't use these tools? And it was hilarious because the way he wrote it, I visualized in my head. I'm like, that's why. Like, I didn't understand how to effectively articulate. Like, I would never use breakpoints or logs for like debugging. So anyway, it's just a great article. If you're wondering, like, okay, like, how do I not use breakpoints in debugging, and why are they considered an addiction? Like, he calls it overdebugging, which I thought was hilarious and awesome. All right, so from a religious standpoint, let's talk about Dave Thomas. So Dave Thomas, if you're not aware, is one of the authors of Pragmatic Programmer. He's written some Ruby books. I mean, he's just a brilliant guy, very experienced. And there's this clip here with Dave Farley where he talks about a couple of things, like not saying waterfall is bad, even though all of us who've done waterfall, like it's awful, right? And the reason is because waterfall is such a big topic that his concern was that saying negative things about it, there could be some good ideas and there are good practices, and you're just throwing it all out wholesale. And I completely agree from the perspective of research. I disagree from programmers. There are enough process nerds, like people who write this white paper, who will look at existing waterfall projects today, who will test waterfall today in 2023, and who will go look back at logs and documentation of those projects to look at the evidence to see it. So I understand where he's coming from, but like no programmer is going to intentionally do a waterfall project to validate with their own quantitative experiences that the data shows that waterfall sucks. Like no one's going to do that, right? And I understand the scientific purpose of like trying to prove that waterfall doesn't work and you actually prove it works. Like I get it, but I thought that was ridiculous. But what really blew me away is that he basically said, I stopped testing for 6 months. And his code was already testable. He had trained his mind to be for decades to write testable code. And so he found that not only did it work, but it was more agile because he didn't have to modify the test when he changed code. He just changed the code, right? But he already was changing it in a way he knew test would break. So like, for example, I think it's either China or Japan where they teach these kids from like young age, like 2 or 3, to use an abacus to do math. And so they're basically human calculators because they can see the abacus in their head. So as you watch these like 16-year-olds and 13-year-olds do tests, they're going like this, right? They're so fast. Imagine if like you've used Copilot so much, you know what it's going to suggest after using it for 5 years. So you can literally turn it off and see Copilot in your head as suggesting code kind of stuff. So it's the same thing with Dave, where he was just writing this code. It was testable code, right? All dependency injection and all this stuff, and the tests are in his head, but he didn't actually write the test. And so it was really easy to quick change code. And I'm just like, what? And he acknowledged, he said, no, I'm not going to, write tests for everything, only certain parts that I deem as, foundational. What does foundational mean? Right. And then he just goes off and he's like, now knowing that, I'm not going to go to a job and share those beliefs because it would make people uncomfortable and I wouldn't get the job. So like even that self-awareness was just so amazing. So really, I haven't seen the whole interview yet. That particular part I saw earlier this week. I'm just like, it's a religious punch to the face. I mean, Dave Farley argued with him a little bit. It was hilarious. So anyway, definitely something to check out. So the last thing I want to talk about was Dave Farley's video, Unit Testing is Not Good Enough. And unit testing in this context is defined as people who've written the code and they write the test after. So they're not writing the test first. That's his definition. And this particular point around 4 minutes really hit home for me because I remember wondering if there was ever a time that I would not hate a code base. I remember for like after 12, 15 years, I just started getting really tired. And I'm like, I wish like after 8 months, I didn't have to hate a code base. And I used to think that because it was right, I was really thinking about this. It was right when AWS came out and they made it so simple to create a monolith repo, but you could create microservice lambdas. So they weren't like as long as you didn't use multiple libraries and you didn't use lambda layers, they were almost microservices because you get the microservice deployment with like CloudFormation, but they were independently deployable. But as long as you didn't share libraries, like a utils folder that you would use in 2 lambdas, then you could independently deploy and change code and not worry about breaking another one. So it was kind of almost, most of the good benefits of microservices. And I realized that I could get away from a lot of the frustrations I had with these large monoliths with big balls of mud. And at the same time, from 5 years prior, everyone kept saying like, well, if you can't manage a big ball of mud, you can't manage microservices. And like, you need to figure out how to manage a ball of mud. I'm like, all these people who said that, I go read their blog and they had, nothing, what I thought was effective. What I didn't realize was what they were talking about was mostly CI/CD and trying to make your process around releasing those code changes safe and integrating safe, things like that. So I didn't understand that. So it was just interesting at the same time. So I started getting code bases I didn't hate. And a lot of that, I believed at the time, was because I wasn't dealing with monoliths. I was dealing with these really small lambdas that were independently testable, deployable. What I didn't realize was I was also learning testing and CI/CD at the same time. So I was, yes, improving things because they were smaller testable units, but also they were testable units, right? So like you could deploy these testable units independently and test independently, really good practices. So this chart right here that I'm showing basically shows that after, I think this is him and a couple of the people, that after months, they would notice that teams who did test after unit testing would start to hate the code base after, umpteen time, right? When it aged. I'm just saying 8 months out of, picking a date, but basically when the code base was considered done, old, right? Where TDD, you constantly did not hate the code base, and completely mirrors my experience. So I definitely thought this was good, because there's a lot of people who are very passionate about test last. They think that the unit tests are good, and they believe in unit tests just like we do. We as in TDD cult people, but they just think testing first is dumb. They think it doesn't work. They think it doesn't really add any value. And I think this video is one of many. I mean, unfortunately, it's a very complicated topic, so you can't just watch one video and go, but this one in particular really argues against test last, and I thought that was extremely important. So out of all of Dave's videos, this one in particular really hit home with this particular point, just because I've noticed from testing first and getting good CI/CD in place, those two things, which, to be fair, TDD's, in my opinion, is part of CI/CD. Dave even admits in that article with Dave that you don't really need TDD to do continuous delivery, but we all believe it's kind of important. So irrespective of that, I just feel that it really resonated, and I completely agreed. And I've seen the benefits of testing first and really, after months, not hating the code base, because the test that change, And I think one thing that a lot of the, his videos don't really talk about much, which he's probably waiting for, is typing in general. A lot of the typing removes a lot of that, because you can use the compiler way faster than unit test to fix a lot of stuff, which is exactly why I don't unit test a lot in Elm. I actually do Cypress and acceptance test only. It's because the compiler is that good. So definitely something to check out if you're curious, like, why don't we just write unit tests? Why don't we test last? Like, he really drives point of why we test first. So definitely a good video for that. So I will put these in the comments for that in there, and I'll explain some of the stuff for the Redux next week. I think from a testing perspective, it's really important. I've gotten a lot of pushback with Redux, mainly because I found the secret to having no job opportunities, no friends. The first is you've got to be a functional programmer who likes strictly typed functional languages, who practices CI/CD. Like, you do those things, like, you'll never get a job or anything. Oh my God, it's Michael Cann. Sorry, guys, I just saw the chat. Holy fish, I haven't seen Michael Cann in forever. So if y'all don't know Michael Cann, he's actually got a good Twitter to follow. He posts a lot of these I'll read later things, and every 3 is one that, like, I just read and gain value from. So Michael Cann is definitely somebody to follow on Twitter. I don't know if you see him in the chat. Yeah, so yes, I still call her Majesty. I can't help it. Yeah, the Twitter feature in particular is, so it's called For You. So if you're going to, where is it? It defaults to following, right? But the For You is neat because I don't follow all these people. And sometimes if I interact with somebody, it'll show their tweets. So it's not just like for example, like, I follow Tim Ottinger, but the other, I think it's I don't know, he's somewhere in Europe. He has a really good article on JavaScript mutation testing, for example. And he and Tim, the British guy, interact a lot. And so I interact with his tweets, but I don't actually follow him. But I don't really notice, because Twitter For You knows that I interact with him. So, like, I don't have to follow him all the time for his political stuff. So it's kind of neat. So anyway, definitely, the For You feature I love. I think it's great. Fantastic. All right, so next week we'll talk about testing in Redux and why would you use that over hooks. If you look at the industry where they're moving, everyone's using hooks. The front side of the React website's doing function components, and I think it's just absolutely ridiculous. I think if you look at hooks, all of them, as side effects, suddenly things get a lot clearer of, like, why somebody who's very passionate about test-driven development wouldn't like hooks. On the same token, I've worked in projects that use both Redux and hooks. And I don't mean the Redux hooks. I mean, like, just Redux and hooks. And, like, the hybrid is fine. So it's not like the end of the world. There's a lot of people who are concerned, around the architecture. I'm like, look, it doesn't have to be either or, right? It's not Elm, where everything is basically Redux, and they work fine. But from a testing perspective, it's very clear to the people that like hooks just don't seem to really give a lot of lip service on any of their blogs or any of their tweets about testing at all. I think we were actually talking about a lot of the different Redux helper libraries, like Redux Toolkit and Easy Peasy and I think it's Rematch and ZooStand. And ZooStand is the only one that has a as far as I can tell. This is a year ago. It could have changed. But ZooStand was the only one that had a designated testing section. And even then, they put it like buried deep in the nav, which is fine. I know you're like, we're trying to help you with Redux. We're not trying to help you with CCD. So I get it, but it's just ridiculous. Oh God, Steven Sachs is here. I gotta go. We'll argue next week, Steven. Oh man, all right. So you do have a point. I still have my Robot Legs T-shirt, and I wear it to work, and nobody knows what Robot Legs is. The worst part of the Robot Legs T-shirt is that when I show it to these millennials and these Gen Zs, they go, "What is that?" And I go, "It's Robot Legs." Oh God, the entire Flash crew is here. All right, Philip Kerman's here. So I show this T-shirt, and they go, "What is Robot Legs?" And I'm like, "Well, it was an MVC-S framework for Flash and Flex." And they go, "What is MVC-S?" I'm like, "Well, it's like a model view controller, but they had a service layer, really good dependency injection, and a little bit more supervising controller." And they're like, "What does that mean?" I'm like, "All right, well, do you know Model View Controller?" They're like, "No." And so I'm like, "Do you know Martin Fowler?" And they're like, "No." And so you have to like rewind like 15 years to a decade and like get them ramped up. I'm like, all right, here's what Model View Controller is. And here's, all that stuff. And then get them back up. And then you can explain Robot Legs. But it's very similar to like, if you have to explain a joke, it's not funny. And so when they see the T-shirt, they can't even read the circles anymore. So they're just like, I don't understand why you're wearing that T-shirt. I'm like, because it's awesome. That's why. So anyway, good times. All right. So that's it. We'll talk about that Prezo next week. It was good seeing the Flash community. Thanks for showing up, y'all. I'll see y'all next week.